Just a warning, this lawsuit is extremely graphic, containing descriptions of sexual assault, sex trafficking and rape. Hello and welcome back to Diddy on Trial with me, Anoushka Mutanda-Dougherty, from the BBC World Service YouTube channel. Every week we're bringing you the latest news on the upcoming Diddy case. He's due in court on May 5th, charged with sex trafficking, transportation for prostitution and racketeering with conspiracy. He denies all the charges. Today, we're going through an 87-page civil lawsuit. It names celebrity co-defendants, alleges trafficking over state lines, has a separate Michael Jackson element, and accuses Diddy of Rico by running a criminal enterprise which the lawsuit terms the Diddy Sexual Abuse and Cover-Up Enterprise. Diddy's team say no sane person reading this complaint can credit this story, and they're already suing the lawyer who filed this for $50 million over comments she made to the media on a separate case. And then later, because everyone is talking about Rico on the federal side and the civil side of things, we have crime historian Christian Cippolini telling us how this charge was tailor-made to take down the mob. Okay, first we're going to take a look at this civil lawsuit, and our resident criminal defence attorney Shaun Kent is with me to listen and help me analyse what this all means. Hi Shaun.
Hey, how are you doing?
Right, so this lawsuit is long, 87 pages, so I appreciate you having read and gone through all of it. There are multiple players and events taking place in different states. We've contacted the people mentioned in the lawsuit requesting a response to what's been alleged. Some people are not public figures and they haven't responded to these requests. So when it comes to those figures, we're not naming them as we don't have a way of reflecting their side of the story. This is an amended lawsuit. So, Shaun, that means one was filed first and now they've made changes to it, right?
Correct. So that means the original lawsuit was filed on October 15th, 2024. And then, make sure I have the date exactly right. They went back on February 6th, 2025 and asked the court permission to amend. And in their February 6th filing, they said, we have done more investigation and we need to add stuff to our complaint to make it more accurate.
So they've said that they've got new information and they refile. You might remember this lawsuit if you've been listening to the pod for a while. It's filed by Ariel Mitchell-Kidd, so she's a lawyer who's being sued by Diddy currently in another case for defamation, and it's Ashley Parham's lawsuit. So when this was originally filed, there were other co-conspirators. Some were named and some were included as Jane and John Doe's. It alleged that on March 23rd, 2018, Ashley was gang raped and assaulted by Diddy and others. It's now been refiled to name co-defendants, add more claimants, and a lot more detail, a whole sort of second half of this lawsuit. I'm going to run through a few of the new additions. So on page 17 of the lawsuit, it alleges that internet personality Drewski doused plaintiff with more oil and lubricant and then jumped on top of plaintiff's body, treating it like a slip and slide. It then goes on to claim that Drewski begins vaginally raping plaintiff. Now, we've heard this allegation before. Shaun, the use of language there and just the way that's phrased, is that normal? It feels a bit odd.
It is, and trust me, I've looked at a lot of lawsuits. 87 pages is insane. It just is. It's a very lengthy lawsuit. That's how they chose to file their lawsuit. But the language is oddly specific, and you usually don't see that. And it's not necessary. That's the biggest thing. It's superfluous, if you will. Like, it's just additional for sensationalism. I don't know why that language is necessary. What does it help prove or not prove? So, no, I'm not used to seeing stuff like that in the lawsuit.
Drewski has responded publicly. We haven't heard back from him in the request we sent, but he said online, this allegation is a fabricated lie. I wasn't a public figure in 2018. I was broke living with my mum without any connections to the entertainment industry at the time of this allegation. So the inclusion of my name is truly outlandish. My heart breaks for actual victims of abuse, but I'm fully confident that the evidence will expose this falsehood and the individuals who are maliciously trying to game the legal system to peddle false narratives. He's not the only celebrity name that's mentioned. So also on page 17, it alleges that, quote, at some point during this ordeal, plaintiff remembers the defendant referring to another Doe as Cornelius and remembered the name because it was odd and unique. Plaintiff has come to discover the defendant who raped her was defendant Odell. So that's Odell Beckham Jr., OBJ, whose middle name is Cornelius. it becomes clearer later on in the lawsuit that they allege that people are using their middle names as code names. Now, we asked him for a statement and he hasn't responded to us, but he has put one out publicly saying, "I have been informed of the allegations about me in a suit in California. I really can't believe that my name is mentioned in that matter. There is absolutely no truth to those allegations. I do not know and have never met the person that filed the suit. I was not anywhere near Orinda, California at that time. In fact, I don't think I've ever been to Orinda, California. I have never done anything like that, and I would never do anything like that to anyone. I'm confident that these ridiculous claims against me will be dismissed." People are saying that it sounds like Drewski and OBJ were kind of blindsided by the lawsuit, and the first they saw of it was on social media. So do we assume that they haven't been made aware before this was like filed?
Normally, like I would be guessing, but in this situation, I agree that they would have been blindsided. And then if you look at the online filings, our federal system requires everything to be filed specifically online. There's nowhere in the federal filings that show that either of these two individuals have been served or given a copy of the actual lawsuit or answered the actual lawsuit. So I'm assuming they found out when everybody else found out, which is crazy if you think about it.
The amended lawsuit continues in a similar way to the original lawsuit filed in October of 2024. However, there is a difference. So it alleges after Ashley Parham has experienced sexual abuse, sexual assault, and gang rape, she manages to escape, goes to a neighbor's house, and then a police officer turns up who she believes is with the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Department. But now, in the new filed version, she says she knows this person to be one of the co-defendants called John Pelletier. Now, he is an actual police officer, but was not with Contra Costa County Sheriff's Department. So he was posing as someone from there, the lawsuit alleges, and offered her no assistance and basically told her to go home after she says, I've been brutally raped by Diddy and a bunch of other people. John Pelletier is a police officer and is now the current chief of Maui Police in Hawaii. The police department sent this response on his behalf. Chief Pelletier has no connection whatsoever to any individuals named in the lawsuit. The allegations suggesting his involvement are entirely unfounded. We are confident that the evidence will demonstrate these claims to be false and will expose those who are deliberately trying to manipulate the legal system to spread misleading narratives. In 2018, while serving as a captain in Las Vegas, Chief Pelletier was honored by the Rape Crisis Center for his exceptional leadership and commitment to community safety, specifically through his role as champion of the Stay Safe program dedicated to sexual assault prevention. These baseless allegations not only harm Chief Pelletier, but also show a lack of respect for victims of abuse whose voices deserve to be heard and supported with compassion and integrity.
What's interesting about that is, like I said, when I was doing my research and looking at it, I want to make sure I say their names right, the Contra, whatever, that police department specifically said, we looked into it and there was no merit to this situation. So this goes into a different type of level of potential cover up. That's wild, just based upon these allegations. I'm not saying they're true or not true, but the Contra Police Department said, we did get this allegation, we did look into it, and we discounted it and said there was nothing there. Do you know how strong that is for a police department to come in and say that a rape did not happen when someone says it did? So that's fascinating to me, because usually police departments don't do that.
Yeah, so Ashley Parham did file a police report that is on record. They claim investigate it. I have spoken to them. They said the same thing. We investigated this and it was unfounded. So these things are included in this lawsuit, in the amended lawsuit. They're also included in the original filing. And it only gets more, I don't know what word to use, dramatic. It gets more layered as it goes on, because there's a second half of this amendment with two new plaintiffs, a Jane Doe and a John Doe, who are described as being a mother and son. And it says that, quote, plaintiffs John and Jane Doe met with defendant Diddy, so they previously knew him, through their connection in the music industry, as plaintiff John Doe was a previous plaintiff against Michael Jackson for sexual assault as a minor. They're in the industry, or they're connected to the industry, so that's put in there as context, background for who this Jane and John Doe are. They claim to have been trafficked by Pelletier and other co-defendants on the lawsuit from Vegas to California, passing through a series of what they term safe houses. And on page 31 of the lawsuit, it says, quote, it was apparent to plaintiffs this was a professional operation syndicate. They talk about seeing a list of houses or locations that they believe were safe houses that they could be moved to. So like you say, this turns it into something else because this is crossing state lines, talking about places they could be moved to. They are held at gunpoint, they claim, they allege, put into the back of SUVs and moved around the country. That's a huge allegation.
It is huge. And I'm glad you brought it up because people do get confused because the civil allegation in here is similar to the federal criminal allegations against Diddy. It's the same one. It's Rico. And people get confused that, wait, what do you mean you can have a Rico civil charge and a Rico criminal charge? But that's exactly what they've alleged. They're using this corrupt organization to cover up the allegations, cover up Diddy's actions, that he is the leader of this Rico organization. And sort of like these two, Jane and John Doe's, are saying that this organization is created to be the cover up this cavalcade of indiscretions that Diddy is doing, and that's the whole point of this organization, and that's the lawsuit. So it's wild if you think about it.
Yeah, and I mean, Rico is coming up left, right, and centre. Later on in the program, we're talking to a crime historian who sort of does the history of how it started with the mob and what was going on, how it was almost like tailor-made to take down the mob. And now we're seeing it leveled against Diddy. And what is described here in the second part of the lawsuit is a cover-up. They talk about going to these houses and sort of it being strange that when they're screaming for help, neighbours weren't coming outside and people weren't getting involved. The neighbours come out and they hear gunshots and then they don't call the police. So they're trafficked, they claim, alleged, by multiple different people on their journey to their final destination. One of the people who was trafficking them, they recognise because, quote, this person had also filed a lawsuit against superstar singer Michael Jackson in 2005 and filed a creditor's claim against the Jackson estate upon his untimely demise in 2009. Jane and John Doe, the mother and son, have filed a lawsuit against Jackson. Now they're claiming that one of the people who's trafficking them across state lines has also filed another lawsuit against Michael Jackson. They then claim that they eventually end up in the location where Ashley Parham, our original plaintiff, claims she was being assaulted. They claim to have witnessed the assault. If you remember from the first time we covered this, it's extremely graphic. The son, the John Doe, also claims that Diddy tried to force him to rape Parham. And he says, as an explanation of why this might be, quote, plaintiff John Doe believes defendant Diddy wanted plaintiff to rape plaintiff Parham so they could frame him in the event plaintiff Parham reported her assault. Okay, all the pieces are coming together and he's there to potentially frame him in this assault. But one thing I don't understand with this, and it says it a few different times throughout the lawsuit, plaintiff so-and-so believes this. Plaintiff so-and-so believes that.
You can bring a lawsuit for anything, any reason you want. Usually the phrase that we use is upon information and belief. And there's two types of evidence. There's direct evidence and there's circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence is eyewitness testimony, actual facts, DNA, things of that nature. That's direct evidence. This person saying that they saw something would be direct evidence. This person saying that they witnessed something would be direct evidence. I think it's circumstantial evidence, but it ain't coming into court. So the entire reason it is to make this complaint completely more sensational because it's not necessary, as mentioned. When you look at these lawsuits, what ends up happening is when they get a copy of it, you have to answer it. And when you answer a lawsuit, you can only do really three things. You can admit, so they can go through and admit each line of the paragraph. They can say, I admit that Drewski was there. They can admit it. They can deny it, or they can say, we have no knowledge. That's it. It's admit, deny without knowledge. So you don't have to explain. So that's why a lot of this lawsuit doesn't make any sense. So when Diddy is answering this lawsuit, a lot of it's going to be deny it or without knowledge. Deny or without knowledge. I don't know if he sued Michael Jackson without knowledge. So it's a weird lawsuit.
One last detail from the lawsuit. It then says that the mother, Jane Doe, was forced to sign documents while her son's been taken elsewhere and allegedly forced to participate in the rape of Miss Parham. The mother, Jane Doe, was forced to sign documents that, quote, plaintiff believes the documents were related to creditors' claims plaintiffs had against the Michael Jackson estate. So it ties up the narrative of why they would have been trafficked from Las Vegas to this location to sign these documents about Michael Jackson and potentially frame the son during this alleged sexual assault of this woman, Ashley Parham. However, it leaves a lot of unanswered questions like what is the creditor claim? What does it have to do with the Jane and John Doe? There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of different people. And we asked Diddy's team about this, and they addressed pretty much all of it. They said this new complaint brought by an attorney has already been sued for defaming Mr. Combs. So we've told you about that. It's a 50 million lawsuit against the attorney who filed this to do with Courtney Burgess and claiming to have seen freak-off tapes with minors on News Nation. They go on to say this demonstrates the depraved lengths plaintiffs will travel to garner headlines in pursuit of a payday. Mr. Combs was nowhere near Orinda, California on the day Miss Parham claims she was assaulted there, and the Contra Costa Sheriff's Department has already confirmed Miss Parham's claims were determined to be unfounded following a thorough investigation. In an attempt to salvage her claims following the investigation, debunking them, Miss Parham has now invented an even wilder narrative alleging a vast and facially implausible conspiracy between law enforcement, local civilians, and media industry players. Her far-fetched tale contains it all: fake cops, cash bribes, and an alleged victim of the late Michael Jackson, who was purportedly kidnapped across state lines and forced to, quote, sign paperwork at gunpoint, close quote, while shepherded through a web of safe houses. No sane person reading this complaint can credit this story. Mr. Combs looks forward to having his day in court, where these lies and the perverse motives of those who told them will be revealed. Has this actually been given to Diddy? Has he been served?
He has not been served, is what it's sort of like the kids say, you've been served. And that's where it comes from. You have to be served with a lawsuit, which basically means, just like you see on television, a process server goes and knocks on your door and says, Mr. Combs, you've been served. Here's a copy of the lawsuit. And then they come back and they write a piece of paper. They put out an affidavit that we served Shaun Combs at the Manhattan Department of Correction. At this point in time, I gave him a copy of it, or I gave it to somebody at his residence who's allowed to accept service. As I mentioned to you earlier, our online federal filings show specifically when someone has been served or when they have answered. He hasn't been served yet. And it's hard to serve somebody who's in the Department of Corrections. It's really hard because you can't get to him. You just can't go in there and talk to Diddy and say, hey, man, I want to go see Diddy and see what he's doing. Can I give him some paperwork? It's harder than people think.
Shaun, thank you so much for this today. And thank you for reading through an 87-page lawsuit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really appreciate this. And thank you for breaking it down for us. We'll see you very soon.
No problem. You have a wonderful day. Thank you for having me.
Now, it seems like everybody is talking about Rico charges when it comes to the upcoming Diddy case. He's been accused of Rico on the federal side, and now we've just heard a civil lawsuit that accuses him of Rico there. Joining me now is crime historian Christian Cippolini, who is going to tell us how this charge came to be and how it was used to tackle the mob. Hi, Christian.
Hi, Anoushka. Thanks for having me.
Before we understand kind of the genesis of Rico, we need to look at what the United States was like before that, and they was facing a particular problem with the mob and mafia. How big of an issue was that?
It was a big enough issue in the 20th century that by the 1950s, the United States Senate decided to have some hearings into related racketeering, antitrust kind of things. The problem was you had law enforcement agencies like the predecessor to the DEA, the Bureau of Narcotics, was aware of organized crime, Italian, Jewish, etc. Whereas the FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, was sort of in denial until the late 1950s, 1960s. When you have this disjointed kind of federal legal issue, dealing with something that most people knew was the elephant in the room. The mob does exist. But what the mob did in the United States, particularly from 1920s through the 1960s, is they ran everything that was illegitimate and a lot of legitimate businesses. So yes, you have gambling, prostitution, narcotics, but then they also had, up until, really the 1980s, early 90s, control of legitimate businesses like garbage disposal was a big one. construction businesses. And where was the epicenter of this large network? New York City, where the five families, as they were dubbed, the five main mafia families. But the mob was so big and extensive. You had the groups that ran the show, and then you had associates spread all over the place. So it was the elephant in the room. Everybody knew there was a mobster on every other corner, if you wanted to call them that, and they had influence economically and socially. So in the United States, it's become almost Americana, a little bit of the fabric of the United States. So the federal government looked at this as an issue
Well,
because they were making money and there were bad things happening to make that money.
so if it's such a widespread, well, it's accepted, like you say, almost part of the fabric of the country itself, was there official complicity then in some of the goings on?
This is fact. You cannot operate on a multi-million dollar level, talking about, decades ago, and that would be billions if they were doing it, but multi-million dollar level, you cannot successfully operate at that level unless you have people in your pocket that are in politics or high up in business organizations on the legitimate end. So yes, it's not a conspiracy. This actually happened. I mean, it is conspiracy, but not conspiracy theory. You cannot operate on that level unless you have that. Gangsters are opportunists. An opportunity arises. Take a prohibition in the United States. They took away alcohol. They swooped in. And it was the same with narcotics. There's some denial that the mafia didn't deal drugs in the United States. I can assure you, yes, they did. It followed right in the footsteps of alcohol prohibition. They fell at around the same time. Um, but yes, prostitution, gambling, extortion, loan sharking, basically charging high interest to give a loan to somebody that can't get it from the bank. So, what happens though when you become an organization large that conducts most of its business in the shadows? You can't call the police if something happens. You have to police yourself. So what does that create? Murder and mayhem. Hence the dark, bloody side of the mob in America. How do you police your own organization? By violence, essentially.
So then when when we think about Rico, it was an answer to the inability to get the people at the top. Why was it difficult to take down the bosses if you know who the fine families are, if you know who the mobsters are?
That's a great way you pointed that out because the federal government wasn't inept. They understood, at least certain departments were well aware that some people are in charge and some are the minions. But the problem is insulation. Setting up any kind of an organization, you insulate your CEOs, your CFO from, potential lawsuits, like in legitimate business, from danger. That's what the mob did. When you made it through the ranks in the hierarchy, you were afforded certain protections. Other people were going to take the fall for you. It's almost like if you signed up for this job, you were a street level soldier. And to your point, the government was having a very difficult time getting the guys they knew were calling the shots down the hierarchy.
I'm assuming then there's a pretty strong code of like, if you get caught, you don't snitch because then something will happen to you.
Sure. The Sicilians, 2 centuries ago, really came up with this kind of existential concept of omerta. Can be, people have different definitions of it, but basically it means you take care of things yourself or within your group. You don't speak to law enforcement. You don't snitch on somebody, rat them out. That stuck with almost every organized crime group in the United States. Didn't matter what ethnicity or if you were part of the mob, the rule was you get caught, you take that.
You said the epicenter is New York, right? And we've got these five families. Who are these five families?
The five family structure was born in 1931 when the Young Turks, as they were called, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, guys like that, Al Capone in Chicago, all came up together and they thought, why do all these Sicilians and Southern Italians fight with each other and rob each other? Why don't we take that idea of not one giant boss, but bosses in sections and geographic areas, and we work together. That was essentially the birth of the five families, which ultimately sort of called the shots for the entire country, although every major city had their own families, from Philadelphia to Los Angeles, San Francisco. But a lot of them would still answer back, or at least seek the influence and approval of New York. So, yeah, even though they're all supposed to get along and they sit on a board of directors, throughout the 70s, 80s, there was a lot of backstabbing. The federal government was aware, and thus jumped to 1970. Okay, the mafia exists, the mob's a real thing, we've got some turncoats that showed us what it works like. How do we get the guy who committed the crime, the guy in the middle, and the guy who made the call? That was it.
But when they created Rico, isn't it right that they didn't immediately use it to its fullest potential?
Sure, when Rico was instated, it in and of itself is a super complex kind of law. Not everybody understood it. I'm not sure the government knew exactly how to use RICO until early mid 1980s. They tried again, and it really was about getting the mob. So everybody knows the reason they even started this is to go after the mob and any groups sort of like that.
So,
In theory.
in theory, who changes the game? Who gets it going?
Well, somebody probably everybody's heard of by this point was Rudolph Giuliani, was the one when he stepped into the role of state attorney in New York, in the early 1980s. He decided to wage a war against organized crime. He had money, he had a presence and a voice, and he used it to apply RICO to go after the five families, the bosses, and everybody underneath that they could,
What does the first sort of success with Rico look like?
putting away some or all of the bosses. And to an extent, after Rudy Giuliani's 1985 assault, yes, the ones that were known. It should be noted, though, that the mob is not dumb either, and they had what would like, not even a lame duck boss, but sort of like the facade, the de facto. Oh yeah, that guy's our boss, but really the boss is somewhere else or already in prison. So it wasn't this perfect thing. Rico applied, everybody goes to jail. It didn't quite work out like that.
But it did significantly weaken the mob power structure by the 90s.
Absolutely. No doubt. Anytime you take out major figures successfully in court, it does. There's always that dark side. You create a power vacuum. There's always somebody waiting to take your crown. Look at ancient history. The Greeks were on top. They weren't going to be on top forever. By the 1980s, you had so many even smaller groups ready at any point when the opportunity presented itself. You already had the Mexican and Colombian narco dealers. The burgeoning groups were rising up. to come in. You had Eastern European groups already in New York. You had the African American, you had the Latino American. There were a lot of groups already here. So yeah, that there's always somebody.
But those laws can then be applied to those new power structures that step in. Now people have figured out how to use them. Because the thing that I think is quite confusing is we say, oh, Rico was the charge that took down the mob. And that's its genesis. But a lot of people now, casual observers, they say, well, I know Rico because I hear it in a lot of rap songs, or I saw the ASAP Rocky trial, or I saw that rapper or this group. But really what you've explained there is an evolution of, well, like smaller almost groups defined by ethnicity filled up this massive gap that were organized crime groups. And that's where you get things like the Bloods and the Crips. And then maybe from that, you see how it links to modern day hip hop culture. It's just an interesting evolution that they're all modeled on the mob, or they're all following that same power structure.
You know what? It's almost like there's a curtain up or tunnel vision when the government is going after a group. For years, it's the mob, the particularly the Italians. We're going after them. You kind of lose sight of the other groups that are just building and evolving. So by the time, you had the rap kicked off, into the public persona by the mid 1980s, but there was a real thing with ethnic cultural groups developing behind the scenes.
Thank you so much for this, because I mean, it's just, I could sit here and listen to you all day. That's absolutely fascinating, and we really appreciate you coming on the programme.
Oh, thank you, Anoushka. I appreciate it.
That's it from Diddy on Trial on the BBC World Service YouTube channel with me, Anoushka Mutanda-Dougherty. If you'd like to send us a question or a message on WhatsApp, you can get us at +44 330 123 551. That's +44 330 123 551. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a thing.